In 2001, a company with a board of directors that included a former U.S. Secretary of Commerce, the former chairman of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and multiple PhDs from Stanford and Harvard collapsed overnight. $74 billion evaporated, 20,000 people lost their jobs, and every single one of those brilliant minds said the same thing: I had no idea. But here's what nobody talks about. It wasn't ignorance that blinded them. It was intelligence, or more precisely, it was the appearance of intelligence that short-circuited everyone's ability to ask the most basic question. Does this actually make sense? Your brain makes about 35,000 decisions every single day, and it simply doesn't have the energy to carefully analyze each one. So it uses shortcuts. One of the most powerful shortcuts is called authority bias. It's the cognitive tendency to attribute greater accuracy and wisdom to the opinion of an authority figure, regardless of the actual content of that opinion. Picture this scenario. You're sitting in a doctor's office. The physician, wearing a white coat with a stethoscope draped around her neck, tells you that you need a specific medication. How many of us actually question that recommendation? How many of us ask to see the clinical studies, request a second opinion before we even leave the room, demand to understand the mechanism of action? Most of us don't. And there's an evolutionary reason for that. For most of human history, deferring to authority kept you alive. The elder who'd survived 40 winters knew which berries were poisonous. The experienced hunter knew when the ice was too thin to cross. Questioning authority took time and energy you often didn't have. But here's where it gets interesting. Your brain doesn't actually evaluate whether someone deserves authority. It responds to symbols of authority. The white coat, the framed degrees on the wall, the impressive title, the institutional affiliation. In 1966, psychiatrist Charles Hoffling conducted an experiment that revealed just how powerful this bias really is. He had researchers call hospital nurses, posing as doctors, and order them to administer twice the maximum dosage of a medication to patients. The drug was actually a harmless placebo, but the nurses didn't know that. 95% of the nurses began to administer the medication without question. They violated hospital policy, exceeded safe dosage limits, and took orders from someone they'd never met. All because the voice on the phone claimed to be a doctor. Authority bias didn't just influence their judgment, it completely bypassed it. And this isn't just about life or death medical decisions. Every time you believe a financial claim because it came from someone with chief economist in their title. Every time you accept a business strategy because a Harvard MBA proposed it. Every time you trust a number because it appeared in an official-looking report. You're experiencing the same cognitive shortcut. The same mental mechanism that helps you make efficient decisions also makes you remarkably easy to manipulate, especially when the authority figures wear expensive suits and have corner offices. Let's talk about Enron's board of directors in the year 2000. This wasn't a collection of yes men or unqualified cronies. This was, on paper, one of the most impressive assemblies of expertise in corporate America. Robert Belfer, former CEO of Belco Oil and Gas. Norman Blake, former CFO of General Electric. Ronnie Chan, chairman of a Hong Kong real estate empire. John Duncan, former chairman of Gulf and Western. Wendy Graham, former chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the federal agency that regulates derivatives markets. She literally wrote regulations for the exact financial instruments Enron was using. John Mendelsohn, president of the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. Paulo Ferraz Pereira, executive in the Brazilian infrastructure sector. And the crown jewel, William Powers, dean of the University of Texas School of Law. These weren't decorative appointments. According to corporate governance standards, this was a dream board. Diverse expertise, regulatory experience, academic credibility, international business knowledge. They met 5 times a year. They were paid handsomely, between $350,000 and $400,000 annually in cash and stock. They had access to Enron's financial statements, its auditors, its executives, and somehow, they approved the creation of thousands of special-purpose entities designed specifically to hide debt. They signed off on accounting practices that violated basic principles of financial transparency. They watched as Enron reported revenue from deals that generated no actual cash. They reviewed partnerships where Enron's own CFO, Andrew Fastow, was making tens of millions of dollars on side deals that represented massive conflicts of interest. And they asked almost no critical questions. Here's what makes this particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective. When the fraud finally unraveled and investigators deposed these board members, they weren't lying about their ignorance. They genuinely believed they had exercised oversight. William Powers himself later led the investigation into what went wrong. His report, released in February 2002, concluded that the board had failed in its fiduciary duties. But here's the mechanism that failed. Everyone in that room was an authority figure. And when you pack a room full of people whose entire professional identity is built on being the smartest person in the room, something strange happens. Nobody wants to ask the dumb question. Nobody wants to admit they don't understand something. Because admitting confusion signals that maybe you don't belong at that table. Maybe your credentials aren't quite as impressive as everyone else's. Robert J. Dyke, the board's audit committee chairman, had been the dean of Stanford's Graduate School of Business. When Fastow presented Byzantine partnership structures, J. Dyke later admitted he didn't fully understand them. But he didn't stop the presentation and ask for clarification, because Stanford deans aren't supposed to need clarification. Authority bias didn't just flow from executives to the board, it flowed between board members, creating a closed loop where everyone assumed someone else had done the critical thinking. After all, if a former federal regulator and a Stanford dean were comfortable with this arrangement, who were you to raise concerns? The academic foundation for understanding authority bias comes primarily from Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, conducted at Yale University in 1961. You probably know the basic outline. Participants were told they were taking part in a study about learning and punishment. They were instructed by a researcher in a lab coat to administer electric shocks to another person, a learner. Every time that person answered a question incorrectly, the shock started at 15 volts and increased in 15-volt increments up to 450 volts. Clearly labeled, danger, severe shock. The learner was actually an actor who wasn't receiving real shocks. But the participant didn't know that. They heard screams. They heard the learner begging to be released, mentioning a heart condition. And then, eventually, they heard nothing at all. Silence. Which could only mean one thing. Yet when the authority figure, the researcher in the lab coat, calmly said, "The experiment requires that you continue," 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts. They didn't want to. The recordings show them sweating, trembling, verbally protesting. But they continued because the person in the lab coat, representing Yale University, representing science with a capital S, told them to. Now here's what's relevant to financial fraud. Milgram ran variations of this experiment to identify what factors increased or decreased obedience. When the researcher wasn't wearing a lab coat, obedience dropped significantly. When the experiment was moved from Yale's campus to a rundown office building, obedience dropped. When the orders came from someone who seemed like a peer rather than an authority figure, obedience plummeted. The content of the orders never changed. Only the symbols of authority changed. Robert Cialdini explored this further in his book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. He documented how titles, clothing, and institutional affiliations trigger automatic compliance. In one study, researchers had an actor jaywalk across a street. When dressed in a business suit, 3.5 times more pedestrians followed him across against the light compared to when he wore casual clothing. Same persons. Same illegal action. Different costume. The mechanism here is what psychologists call the principle of authority. We're conditioned from childhood to obey authority figures. Parents, teachers, police officers, doctors. This conditioning creates a neural pathway that bypasses critical evaluation. When we perceive authority, our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for critical thinking and skepticism, shows reduced activity. Meanwhile, areas associated with following instructions and conforming to social norms light up. Your brain literally shifts into a different mode of operation. Now, imagine that dynamic in a corporate boardroom. You're sitting across from Jeffrey Skilling, who has a Harvard MBA and was a McKinsey consultant before becoming Enron's president. Next to you is a former cabinet secretary. Across the table is a Stanford dean. The presentation in front of you is 200 pages of complex financial engineering. And when you start to feel that tickle of confusion, that sense that something doesn't quite add up, what does your brain do? It doesn't interpret that feeling as, something is wrong here. It interprets it as, I must not be smart enough to understand this. The authority bias doesn't just make you trust the wrong people. It makes you distrust yourself. Here's the dark pattern nobody talks about. Once you understand authority bias, you can exploit it. And some of the most successful fraudsters in history have been absolute masters at engineering perceived authority. Bernie Madoff didn't just run a Ponzi scheme. He was the former chairman of NASDAQ. He sat on the board of the National Association of Securities Dealers. When your investment returns came from the former chairman of the stock exchange itself, why would you question them? His credentials were his camouflage. Elizabeth Holmes surrounded herself with authority at Theranos. Her board included Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, George Shultz, another former Secretary of State, General James Mattis, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. These weren't medical experts or biotech scientists, but they were titans. Their presence on the letterhead communicated something more important than expertise: legitimacy. When Tyler Shultz, George Shultz's grandson and a Theranos employee, raised concerns about fraudulent test results, he wasn't just fighting the company. He was fighting his own cognitive bias. His grandfather, a man who'd negotiated with foreign governments and shaped international policy, believed in Elizabeth Holmes. Was Tyler really going to trust his judgment over his grandfather's? Authority bias made him doubt reality itself. Morgan Housel writes in The Psychology of Money about how we confuse the appearance of sophistication with actual knowledge. He notes that finance is particularly vulnerable to this because complexity can be manufactured to create the illusion of expertise. Want to seem like an authority? Use jargon. Create proprietary models. Reference obscure academic papers. Speak with absolute confidence about inherently uncertain outcomes. Each of these tactics triggers the authority bias in your audience. Enron mastered this. Their presentations were deliberately complex. Mark-to-market accounting, special purpose entities, synthetic leases, prepaid forward contracts. These weren't just accounting techniques, they were psychological barriers. They signaled, this is expert-level material. If you don't understand it, that reflects on you, not on us. Andrew Fastow, Enron's CFO, won CFO Excellence Award from CFO Magazine in 1999. Think about that. The architect of one of history's largest frauds was professionally recognized for excellence in his field 1 year before the company collapsed. The award itself became another credential, another reason to defer to his judgment. But here's the twist. Some investors did resist. Jim Chanos, the short seller, began questioning Enron's financial statements in $2,000. He didn't have more information than Enron's board. He just had less reverence for authority. He later said the warning signs were visible to anyone willing to look. The cash flow didn't match the reported earnings. The return on capital was mysteriously declining despite soaring stock prices. The debt was clearly being hidden. What was different about Chanos? He'd built a career betting against consensus. His entire investment thesis depended on questioning what authority figures claimed was true. He'd trained himself to override the bias that paralyzed Enron's board. The lesson isn't that all authority figures are frauds. Most aren't. The lesson is that credentialed worship creates an asymmetric vulnerability. It takes thousands of hours to earn a PhD or build a prestigious career. But it takes only seconds for your brain to process those credentials and switch off its skepticism. And that gap, that cognitive shortcut, is where fraud lives. So how do you maintain healthy skepticism without descending into paranoid cynicism? How do you respect expertise without worshiping credentials? Start with a simple rule. Separate the claim from the person making it. When someone presents a financial opportunity, an investment thesis, or a business strategy, write down the core claim, then evaluate it as if it came from a stranger with no credentials whatsoever. Would you believe this if your unemployed cousin pitched it to you at Thanksgiving? If the answer is no, ask yourself what changed. If the only difference is the credentials of the person speaking, you're experiencing authority bias. That doesn't mean the claim is wrong. It means you're not actually evaluating the claim. You're evaluating the resume. Second, actively seek out the contrarian position. For every expert saying one thing, find an expert saying the opposite. Not to create false balance, but to pressure test your own reasoning. If you're nodding along with a Harvard economist's investment advice, go find what a Yale economist thinks. The disagreement itself is valuable data. It proves that expertise doesn't lead to certainty. Third, track predictions. Authority figures make claims about the future constantly. Markets will do this. Companies will do that. Inflation will behave this way. Write them down. Check back in 6 months, a year, 5 years. You'll quickly discover that credentials don't correlate as strongly with accuracy as we assume they do. Philip Tetlock's research, documented in his book Super Forecasting, found that expert predictions were often no more accurate than random chance. The experts who were most confident, who had the most impressive titles and the most media appearances, were actually less accurate than those who expressed uncertainty and updated their views based on new evidence. Fourth, practice asking dumb questions. This is harder than it sounds, because authority bias makes ignorance feel like a moral failing. But in every Enron-style disaster, somebody had a dumb question they were too embarrassed to ask. Wait, how is this company making money? Can you explain this in simpler terms? What happens if you're wrong? These aren't dumb questions. They're structural questions. And they're the ones that reveal fraud fastest. Remember our opening story? $74 billion. A board packed with PhDs and former regulators. 20,000 jobs destroyed. The fraudulent accounting wasn't particularly sophisticated. It was just wrapped in sophisticated language and presented by sophisticated people. And that was enough. The credentials that were supposed to protect shareholders became the smokescreen that obscured reality. Authority bias didn't make smart people stupid. It made them compliant. And compliance, in the face of fraud, is functionally identical to stupidity. The next time you're in a room, and everyone's nodding along because someone important is speaking, remember Enron's board. Remember that intelligence is not immunity. That expertise is not infallibility. And that the most dangerous thing you can do is assume someone else has already asked the hard questions. Your skepticism isn't disrespectful. In a world where authority can be engineered and credentials can be weaponized, your skepticism might be the only thing standing between you and catastrophic loss. If this changed how you think about expertise and trust, subscribe for more psychology behind money decisions. Next, watch our video on how the endowment effect makes you hold losing investments way too long. Thanks for watching.